The rattlesnake did not attack the Apache warrior. It saved him until nightfall. The October sun blazed mercilessly over the Sonoran desert as Miguel Yazzie adjusted his worn baseball cap and squinted at the horizon. At 23, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone raised between two worlds: the modern life of Globe, Arizona, where he worked at the copper mine, and the ancient traditions his grandfather, Thomas, had drilled into him since childhood. Today's hunt was supposed to be simple: track a small herd of javelinas that had been raiding the community gardens on the San Carlos Apache reservation, bring back enough meat for the upcoming harvest celebration. "Remember, Cheege," his grandfather had said that morning using the Apache word for grandson, "the desert speaks to those who know how to listen. Your great-grandfather could track a roadrunner across solid rock. That blood runs in your veins." Miguel shouldered his hunting rifle and began following the javelina tracks that led northeast from the settlement. The familiar sense of creosote, bush, and palo verde filled his nostrils as he moved with practiced silence across the desert floor. His grandfather had taught him to read the land like a book, how the way grass bent revealed the direction of travel, how the depth of a track indicated the animal's weight and urgency, how even the smallest disturbance in the desert's careful balance told a story. The tracks were fresh, maybe 3 hours old, and led toward the rugged country near Apache Leap. Miguel had hunted this area countless times, but something felt different today. The usual sounds of the desert, the calls of cactus wrens, the rustle of pack rats in the undergrowth seemed muted. Even the ever-present buzz of cicadas had quieted to a whisper. As the sun climbed higher, Miguel noticed the javelina tracks beginning to separate. What had been a tight group of 6 animals was now splitting into pairs, heading in different directions. This was unusual behavior for javelinas who typically stayed together for protection. Miguel paused, removing his water bottle and taking a careful sip. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When the animals act strange, pay attention. They know things we don't." Following his instincts, Miguel chose to track the largest set of prints, which headed toward a series of low ridges dotted with saguaro cacti. The terrain grew more challenging as he climbed, loose shale sliding beneath his boots with each step. He moved methodically, checking his compass and marking landmarks: a distinctive twisted mesquite tree, a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a dry wash that would run with water during the monsoons. By midday, the temperature had climbed past 90 degrees. Miguel found shelter beneath an overhanging rock and ate his lunch of fry bread and jerky, washing it down with warm water. From his canteen, the javelina tracks were becoming harder to follow on the rocky ground, but he could still make out the occasional print in patches of soft earth between the stones. As he prepared to continue the hunt, Miguel heard something that made him freeze: the distant sound of an engine echoing off the canyon walls. It was coming from the direction he'd traveled, back toward the reservation. He listened carefully, trying to determine if it was getting closer or moving away. After several minutes, the sound faded completely, leaving only the whisper of wind. Through the Ocotillo, Miguel resumed tracking, but the unease that had been building all morning now settled in his chest like a weight. The desert felt too quiet, too empty. Even the turkey vultures that usually circled lazily overhead were absent. His grandfather had always said that when the desert went silent, it meant one of two things: a storm was coming, or something was very wrong. Looking up at the clear blue sky, Miguel knew it wasn't weather that had the animals spooked. He checked his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual this far from town. But something in the quality of the silence made him decide to head back. The javelinas could wait for another day. As Miguel turned to retrace his steps, he realized, with growing alarm, that the landscape around him looked unfamiliar. The distinctive landmarks he'd been using to navigate, the twisted mesquite, the bear-shaped boulder, were nowhere to be seen. Somehow, in his focus on following the tracks, he'd lost track of his own path. For the first time since childhood, Miguel Yazzie was truly lost in his own desert. The first rule his grandfather had drilled into him was simple: when you realize you're lost, stop moving. Miguel forced himself to stand still despite every instinct screaming at him to keep walking, to find something familiar. He closed his eyes and tried to reconstruct his path, visualizing each turn, each landmark. But the harder he concentrated, the more confused he became. Had he turned left at the arroyo or right? Was the saguaro-studded ridge to his north or northeast? Miguel pulled out his compass, a gift from his grandfather on his 16th birthday. The needle pointed steadily north, but north meant nothing if he didn't know where he'd started from. He tried to remember the general direction of the reservation. Southwest, he thought. But in the maze of ridges and washes that characterize this part of the desert, direction alone wouldn't be enough. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and Miguel knew he had maybe 4 hours of daylight left. He climbed to the highest point nearby, a rocky outcrop crowned with a massive barrel cactus, and scanned the landscape in all directions. Miles of desert stretched before him. Ocotillo, Palo Verde, and Cholla cactus punctuated by the occasional saguaro. In the distance, he could see the dark line of mountains that marked the reservation's boundary. But which mountains? From this angle, they all looked the same. Miguel's mouth was getting dry, and he realized he'd been unconsciously rationing his water since discovering he was lost. Bad thinking. Dehydration would cloud his judgment faster than panic. He took a long drink from his canteen, noting that he had maybe 2/3 left. If he was careful, it would last until tomorrow morning. A movement caught his eye. A roadrunner darting between the mesquite bushes below. Miguel watched the bird's path carefully, knowing that roadrunners often followed game trails that led to water sources. But the bird disappeared into the maze of desert vegetation before he could determine its destination. As the afternoon wore on, Miguel tried various strategies his grandfather had taught him. He looked for the subtle signs that indicated direction, the way barrel cacti leaned slightly southwest, how moss grew on the north side of rocks in shadier areas. But the desert here was so uniform, so vast, that these tiny indicators seemed meaningless against the enormity of his situation. The temperature was dropping as the sun sank lower, and Miguel began to think about the coming night. Desert temperatures could plummet 40 degrees after sunset, and he was dressed for day hunting, jeans, a cotton shirt, and a light jacket. His grandfather had always carried a survival kit, but Miguel had left his in the truck, confident that he'd be back by morning. Just as despair began to creep in, Miguel heard something that made his heart race, the distinctive buzz of a rattlesnake's warning rattle. He froze, scanning the ground around his feet. There, coiled in the shade of a prickly pear cactus not 10 feet away, was a massive diamond-back rattlesnake. Its triangular head was raised, tongue flicking to taste the air, and its tail vibrated in the unmistakable rhythm that had warned desert travelers for millennia. Miguel's first instinct was to back away slowly, but something about the snake's behavior was odd. It wasn't positioned to strike. Its body wasn't in the characteristic S-curve that preceded an attack. Instead, it seemed almost relaxed, its rattle more of an announcement than a threat. The snake's dark eyes fixed on Miguel's, and for a moment, the young Apache felt as if the creature was trying to communicate something. In Apache tradition, encounters with rattlesnakes were significant. His grandfather had told him stories of warriors who had been guided by serpents, of messages from the spirit world delivered through the behavior of desert creatures. But Miguel had always dismissed these as old superstitions, relics of a worldview that had no place in the 21st century. Now, lost and vulnerable in the desert his ancestors had called home for centuries, Miguel found himself reconsidering those old stories. The rattlesnake continued to watch him, its rattle now silent. As the shadows lengthened and the first hints of evening began to cool the air, Miguel made a decision that would have seemed crazy to him that morning. Instead of moving away from the snake, he sat down on a nearby rock and began to wait. If the desert was trying to tell him something, maybe it was time to listen. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the snake's diamond-patterned scales. Miguel watched the creature with growing fascination, noting how it seemed to be conserving energy, how its breathing was slow and measured. As a predator, the rattlesnake was perfectly adapted to its environment. Patient, efficient, deadly when necessary, but otherwise content to simply exist in harmony with the desert's rhythms. Maybe, Miguel thought, there was something to learn from that patience. As twilight deepened, the rattlesnake began to move. Not away from Miguel, as he'd expected, but in a slow, deliberate pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. The massive serpent uncoiled itself and began to move in a wide circle around the area where Miguel sat, its body flowing like liquid mercury across the desert floor. Each movement was precise, economical, as if the snake was following some ancient choreography. Miguel watched, transfixed. His grandfather's voice came back to him. Twiz, snake in Apache, was one of the most powerful spirit guides. They know the secrets of the earth, Thomas had said during one of their long walks in the desert. They feel vibrations we cannot sense, changes in the air pressure, in the moisture content of the soil. A wise Apache pays attention to what the snake knows. The snake completed its circle and came to rest facing east, its head raised as if scenting something on the evening breeze. Miguel found himself unconsciously mirroring the snake's position, turning to face the same direction. That's when he noticed it, the faintest trace of smoke rising in the distance, so thin it was barely visible against the darkening sky. Fire meant people. People meant civilization, safety, a way home. But the smoke was miles away, across terrain that would be treacherous to navigate in the dark. Miguel checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. Full darkness would fall within the hour, and attempting to travel at night in unfamiliar desert was a recipe for disaster. He could step in a hole, fall off a ledge, or worse, encounter one of the many hazards that made the Sonoran Desert deadly after dark. The rattlesnake seemed to sense his dilemma. It moved again, this time positioning itself between Miguel and a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural windbreak. The message was clear. This was a good place to spend the night. Miguel had never felt more acutely aware of his mixed heritage. The rational, modern part of his mind told him he was reading meaning into random animal behavior, that the snake was simply following its own mysterious agenda. But the deeper part of him, the part connected to generations of Apache survivors, recognized something profound in this moment. His ancestors had lived in this desert for centuries, guided by signs and omens that modern science dismissed as coincidence. As the temperature began to drop, Miguel gathered materials for a shelter. He used his knife to cut long branches from a dead Palo Verde tree, creating a simple lean-to against the largest boulder. He stuffed the gaps with dried grass and smaller branches, creating a barrier against the wind that would soon sweep down. From the mountains, the rattlesnake watched his efforts with what seemed like approval, occasionally shifting position but never moving far from the campsite. The work kept Miguel warm as the desert temperature plummeted. By full dark, it had dropped from the day's high of 93 degrees to a bone-chilling 58. Miguel huddled in his inadequate jacket, grateful for the windbreak the boulders provided. The snake had disappeared into a crevice between two rocks, but Miguel could still sense its presence. Above, the desert sky exploded into brilliance. Without the light pollution of the city, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of diamonds. Miguel had seen this sky countless times during childhood camping trips with his grandfather, but tonight it seemed different, more alive, more connected to the earth beneath his feet. His grandfather had taught him the Apache names for the constellations, stories that connected the stars to the seasons, to the movements of animals, to the cycles of life and death that governed the desert. The Big Dipper was Nahuko Spiadi, the male one who revolves. Orion was the sacred hunter, forever pursuing the eternal prey across the sky. As Miguel traced these familiar patterns with his eyes, he began to understand something his grandfather had been trying to teach him for years. The separation between the natural and human worlds was an illusion. The desert wasn't something to be conquered or even just survived. It was something to be joined, to become part of. The cold deepened, and Miguel found himself thinking about the smoke he'd seen. Whoever had made that fire would be warm tonight. probably sharing stories around the flames, safe in their temporary circle of light. But something told him that his place was here, in the darkness, learning lessons he couldn't have grasped in the comfort of civilization. Around midnight, Miguel heard the hunting cry of a great horned owl, followed by the skittering of some small rodent across the rocks nearby. The desert was alive with predators and prey, an endless dance of survival that had been playing out long before humans arrived and would continue long after they were gone. The rattlesnake emerged briefly from its crevice, tongue flicking to taste the night air, before disappearing again. Miguel dozed fitfully, waking frequently as his body fought to maintain warmth. Each time he opened his eyes, he could see the steady glow of the fire in the distance, a beacon that seemed both infinitely far away and strangely close. By dawn, he would have to make a choice: head toward that smoke and the promise of rescue, or trust in whatever wisdom the desert was trying to teach him. As the first pale hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Miguel made his decision. The first light of dawn painted the desert in shades of rose and gold that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Miguel's body ached from the cold night, but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. As he stirred from his makeshift shelter, he found the rattlesnake waiting for him, coiled peacefully on a sun-warmed rock just outside the boulder cluster. The snake's presence no longer seemed threatening or even unusual. Over the course of the night, Miguel had come to think of it as a companion, a fellow survivor navigating the harsh realities of desert existence. Now, in the growing light, he could see details he'd missed the evening before. The intricate pattern of diamonds along the snake's back, each scale catching and reflecting the morning sun like tiny mirrors. Miguel's water was running low. Less than a quarter of his canteen remained. His stomach cramped with hunger, and every muscle in his body protested as he stretched and prepared for what might be his last chance to find his way home. The distant smoke he'd spotted the night before was no longer visible, but he had a rough idea of its direction. As he prepared to leave, the rattlesnake began to move again. This time, its behavior was different from the previous evening's slow, ceremonial circling. The snake moved with purpose, heading not toward the east where Miguel had seen the smoke, but north, toward a series of low ridges that looked identical to a dozen others in the area. Every rational instinct told Miguel to ignore the snake and head toward where he'd last seen human activity. But something deeper, some inherited wisdom that connected him to generations of desert survivors, made him hesitate. His grandfather's words came back to him. The animals know things we don't. When they're trying to tell you something, you better listen. Miguel made a decision that would have seemed insane to his co-workers at the copper mine. He followed the snake. The rattlesnake moved with surprising speed across the desert floor, pausing occasionally to taste the air with its forked tongue before continuing in the same northward direction. Miguel struggled to keep pace, his boots slipping on loose shale as they climbed toward the ridgeline. The sun climbed higher, and soon the desert began to shimmer with heat waves that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. After an hour of steady climbing, Miguel was down to his last few sips of water. His lips were cracked, and his tongue felt thick in his mouth. Doubt began to creep in. Had he made a fatal mistake? Was he following a snake to his death, chasing some romantic notion of Apache spirituality, while the practical path to salvation lay in the opposite direction? That's when he smelled it, the unmistakable scent of water. It was faint at first, just a hint of moisture in the dry air. But as they crested the ridge, Miguel saw something that made his heart race. A tiny oasis tucked into a protected canyon. Below, a natural spring bubbled up from between two massive boulders, creating a small pool surrounded by green grass and even a few cottonwood trees. It was like something from a dream, an impossible pocket of life hidden in the vast emptiness of the desert. The rattlesnake paused at the ridge's edge, as if waiting for Miguel to understand. Then it began its descent toward the water, moving, with the confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. Miguel scrambled down the rocky slope, his exhaustion forgotten in the face of salvation. The spring was real, cold, clear water bubbling up from some underground source. He fell to his knees beside the pool and drank deeply, feeling life return to his body with each swallow. The water tasted of minerals and stone, ancient and pure. As he refilled his canteen, Miguel noticed something that made him laugh out loud. Carved into one of the boulders near the spring were symbols he recognized, Apache pictographs that marked this as a traditional water source. His ancestors had known about this place for generations, had probably saved their lives here countless times over the centuries. The rattlesnake coiled itself in the shade of the largest cottonwood, seeming satisfied with its work. Miguel sat beside the spring and pulled out his compass, trying to get his bearings. From this vantage point, he could see landmarks that looked familiar, a distinctive peak that he remembered from hunting trips with his grandfather, a long ridge that ran north-south like a giant spine across the desert. For the first time since becoming lost, Miguel knew exactly where he was. The spring was located in Hidden Canyon, a place his grandfather had brought him to as a child. From here, it was maybe 5 miles back to the main road, following game trails that would lead him through familiar country. Miguel could be home by noon, sharing this incredible story with his family, back to his normal life as if nothing had happened. But as he prepared to leave, Miguel realized that everything had changed. The night in the desert, the encounter with the rattlesnake, the discovery of the ancient spring. These experiences had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. He felt connected to the land in a way he hadn't since childhood, when his grandfather's stories had seemed like living truth rather than quaint folklore. The rattlesnake stirred from its resting place, tongue flicking to taste the morning air. For a moment, Miguel thought it might accompany him on the journey home. Instead, the snake began to move away from the spring, heading deeper into the canyon toward whatever mysteries lay hidden in the desert's heart. Miguel watched it go with something approaching reverence. The snake had saved his life, had guided him to water when his modern knowledge had failed him. But more than that, it had reminded him of who he was, not just Miguel Yazzie, copper miner and weekend hunter, but a descendant of people who had lived in harmony with this harsh land for countless generations. The walk home took Miguel through country he'd known since childhood, but had never truly seen. Following the ancient game trails that connected Hidden Canyon to the main road, he noticed details that had escaped him for years. The way certain plants grew only near underground water sources, how the flight patterns of ravens could guide a traveler toward human habitation, the subtle differences in soil color that indicated the presence of mineral deposits his ancestors had used for paint and tools. Each step felt like a homecoming, not just to the reservation, but to a part of himself he'd forgotten existed. The morning sun climbed higher, but Miguel no longer minded the heat. He walked with the steady rhythm his grandfather had taught him, a pace that could cover great distances without exhaustion, that worked with the desert's natural cycles rather than against them. By 10 o'clock, Miguel could see the road in the distance, a ribbon of asphalt that connected the reservation to the outside world. As he drew closer, he heard the familiar sound of his truck's engine. His cousin Danny was driving slowly along the shoulder, scanning the desert with binoculars. Behind him, 3 more vehicles formed a search convoy that included his grandfather, several tribal police officers, and what looked like half the men from his neighborhood. Miguel emerged from the desert just as Danny was about to radio that another section had been searched without success. The look of relief on his cousin's face was worth every difficult moment of the past 24 hours. "Miguel, Shikis, we've been looking for you all night." Danny jumped from the truck and embraced him. Grandfather was ready to call in the helicopter rescue team. Within minutes, Miguel was surrounded by worried family and friends, all talking at once, asking questions about where he'd been, what had happened, whether he was injured. Miguel accepted their concern with gratitude, but found himself struggling to explain his experience in words that would make sense to people who hadn't lived it. His grandfather, Thomas, approached last. The old man's eyes were sharp and knowing as he studied Miguel's face. "You look different, Chij," he said quietly. "The desert taught you something." Miguel nodded, not trusting his voice. In the chaos of the rescue, surrounded by the noise of engines and radios and relieved voices. The memory of the rattlesnake already seemed dreamlike, too precious and strange to share with people who would want to analyze it, explain it, reduce it to coincidence and survival instinct. "Tell me later," his grandfather said, understanding. When the others have gone home, the drive back to the settlement passed in a blur of questions and explanations. Miguel told the basic facts: how he'd become lost following javelina tracks, how he'd spent the night near some boulders, how he'd found the old spring and hidden canyon and followed familiar trails back to the road. But he said nothing about the rattlesnake, nothing about the strange sense of communication he'd felt, nothing about the profound shift in perspective that had occurred during those long hours in the darkness. That evening, after the celebration dinner his family had insisted on preparing, Miguel sat with his grandfather on the porch of the old man's house. The desert stretched before them in the gathering dusk, beautiful and mysterious under the emerging stars. "So," Thomas said, filling his pipe with tobacco, "tell me about the snake." Miguel looked at his grandfather in surprise. "How did you know?" Thomas smiled. "Your great-grandfather once told me a story about getting lost near Apache Leap. He was guided to water by a diamondback rattler, just like the stories the old ones used to tell. I've been waiting 70 years to see if it would happen again." In the quiet evening air, Miguel told his grandfather everything. About the snake's strange behavior, the way it had seemed to communicate, how it had led him to the spring that saved his life. Thomas listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. "The old ways aren't dead," Thomas said when Miguel finished. "They're just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. That snake didn't save your body, it saved your spirit. You came back from the desert remembering who you are." Over the following weeks, Miguel found that his grandfather was right. The experience had awakened something in him that changed how he saw everything: his work, his relationships, his place in the world. He began spending more time with the tribal elders, learning stories and traditions he'd ignored for years. He started teaching himself the Apache language, discovering concepts and ways of thinking that had no equivalent in English. 3 months later, Miguel quit his job at the copper mine and took a position with the tribal wildlife management program. His new job took him into the desert regularly, monitoring animal populations, maintaining water sources, protecting the land that his people had called home for centuries. He never saw the rattlesnake again, though he looked for it every time he visited Hidden Canyon. But sometimes, in the early morning or late evening when the desert was quiet and the light was soft, Miguel felt its presence, not as a specific creature, but as part of the larger spirit that connected all living things in the vast, beautiful, dangerous landscape of home. The desert had taught him its most important lesson: that salvation often comes from the most unexpected sources, and that wisdom sometimes wears the face of what we most fear. The rattlesnake had not attacked the Apache warrior because, in the deepest sense, they were not enemies at all. They were both children of the same harsh, generous land, both survivors in the endless dance of life and death that made the desert sacred. Miguel carried that knowledge with him every day, a gift more precious than water in a drought, more valuable than all the copper in the Arizona mountains. The snake had saved him until nightfall, and the man who emerged from that darkness was someone his ancestors would have recognized, an Apache who remembered how to listen to the voice of the land.